Hello, it's October 27th, 2022, and this is the weekly Backdrop Developers meeting. We get together every week to talk about things that are happening development-wise in the world of Backdrop. My name is Nate Lampton. I'm Quick Sketch on the internet, calling from Oakland, California. I'm a core committer for the Backdrop project, and I'm joined here by 5 others. We'll do kind of around the room introductions and let everybody, if you would introduce yourself, uh, where you're from or where you're calling from, and any job role introduction of anything like that you want to say. Let's start off with Greg, and then we'll go to Luke.
Hi, my name is Greg. I'm joining from Melbourne, Australia, and yeah, not much to report. It's just I'm still trying to play catch with everything, trying to help where I can.
Thanks, Greg. Luke, and then Tim.
Hi, I'm Luke McCormick. I'm a web project manager in San Ramon, California.
Thanks, Luke. Tim, and then Jen.
Hi, my name is Tim Erickson. I'm St. Paul Tim in the forums and GitHub, and really excited or happy about the recent Backdrop Live, and excited about our new community meetings that we'll be doing starting in 2 weeks. Talk to you later, or that's all.
Thanks, Tim. Jen, and then Kevin.
Jen Lampton, joining from Oakland, California. That's it.
Kevin Reinen. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. I work for the University of Colorado, and it snowed today in Boulder, so you have that.
Oh, lovely.
Nice.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. It's glad to have everyone here. Before we get into general discussion, Jen will do the little community update.
So this week we have 3 new contributed modules: heading, TC, PDF, and Shopify. So thanks to our contributors for continuing to get these out.
Yeah, and actually, before we go into general discussion, Tim, I know you just had a community meeting, but can you give us just a quick recap on Backdrop Live, just for people that watch this meeting?
Sure. I think we had a pretty good turnout. It wasn't our busiest, but we had a good, solid participation. A lot of good topics. Unfortunately, I'm not sure what else. There was a lot of information dumped, so I don't know what to pick out if anybody else has anything to share. But we do have a couple of sessions that were recorded, and I haven't even thought about getting them online yet. So we'll try to get those up. It's just a few of them. We did do our Backdrop for Beginners track, which was a new thing, and we think that went pretty well. We had good turnout for it, and people seemed to respond well. So yeah, I don't know if anybody else has any real highlights they could mention. But
Yeah, with a Backdrop for Beginners that you said, imagine if the presenters were ready actually for it, prepared.
Be even better. I guess the last thing I'll say is that we're probably going to do our next Backdrop Live in about 6 months. So a little further, a little more spacing between them moving forward. So, but thanks everybody.
Yep, great. Another thing, we haven't made any other announcements other than at Backdrop Live of our new core committer. Joseph Flatt has joined the leadership team as new core committer to the project. His handle is Joseph. We're really happy to have Joseph on as an additional reviewer and committer for the project. He's already made at least one commit, I know, and that one commit actually is very exciting. Actually, I'll talk about that in a second. But we have some other things to do logistically. Like, we should probably write a blog post talking about our current leadership team. I know that we've had some change ups, like even the PMC had is down one person, for example. While I was onboarding Joseph, I also cleaned up, or cleaned up, that sounds so rude. I reached out to our previous core committer, Jeff St. Pierre, who hasn't been active in the Backdrop world for a couple of years now, and just asked if he was, still interested in maintaining his access. And he politely wrote back, said he missed us guys, missed us folks, but that he should probably, have his access taken away because he wasn't using it. So
We miss him too. Is he otherwise doing okay?
seemed like he was doing fine. He's
Okay.
working at Pfizer now, which I was not aware of. Yeah, Pfizer has a large Drupal base, as I understand it. So, yeah, we should. I mean, thank you, Jeff, for all of your service in the past. And welcome, Joseph. Thank you for your service in the present and the past. So, yeah, some changeover in the leadership team, but that's great. Let's see. Oh yeah. So the one thing that Joseph committed last week was one of my favorite issues, issue 5245, which was supporting PHP CS, work that Indigo Zella has been putting together for the past couple of months. That now all pull requests filed against core automatically get validated against a set of our coding standards. It's not 100% comprehensive at this point. We've started a new repository that includes the basic coding standards rules, tabs versus spaces, and obvious syntax errors, things of that nature. And we're working on expanding out that repository kind of as we go. But that new syntax checking is now active against all pull requests that are filed against core. And if there's syntax issues in your pull request, then GitHub will now politely give you little code comments saying, hey, you got to change this to that. So hopefully that will reduce the amount of time that we spend just correcting each other's like typos and things like that, which would be nice. So I'm very excited about that. 5245. We're not exactly sure how well it's going to work. There's only been a couple of pull requests come in, and so far they've been green as far as I've seen. So they haven't had issues. But yeah, I'm excited to see how that affects our core development processes. We also have a follow-up for PHP Stan, which does something similar. Issue 5467 is PHP Stan. And that work is still continuing. And it does something different. Rather than syntax highlighting, it will be able to do things like tell us if we're using deprecated functionality that doesn't exist in PHP 8.1 or something like that. So that will be a similar but slightly different tool in that it analyzes our code for things like actual like classes that don't follow correct dependency trees, like actual, like if this code were to be executed, potential problems that could be arise from the way that your code has been written, as opposed to the syntax checker, which is just like making sure it's formatted properly. Kind of two different spheres there.
Do we
But-
have sorry, do we have any ticket for CSpell? Which
I don't even know what that is. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think the Drupal has that as well. So it actually does spell check.
Oh,
So yeah, and you can specify words that that you add them in the dictionary and the correct spelling. I think RG Piano mentioned something about in an irrelevant issue about the word resizable, if it is EA or just resizable just with an A. And I did a search and there was like 17 instances with the just A thing and 3 instances of so things like that, but also typos, instead of the HTE, so things like that. If we don't have an issue for that, I'll file one.
well, we do have an issue. I just searched for it. It's issue 5811, and you filed it 28 days
Okay,
ago.
there you go. I'm getting old. All right, cool. There you go.
Yeah, but it's very, very well covered in that issue. So thank you for filing that. Yeah, that's neat. Okay, yeah, so that's those are the announcements and everything. Yeah, Backdrop Live, I agree, it was a great event. Yeah, lots of news and we had several new people come into the community who have persisted for the past week so far, and that's been really exciting to get in those new people. And thanks so much, Tim and Jen, for organizing and running that conference as always.
Mostly Tim.
Okay. All right. So the only item that we had in the forum post for this week, under forum .backdropcms.org, there's under the events section, there's always a post there to solicit ideas for topics for these meetings. Kevin, who's joining us today, and Tim went back and forth a little bit, wanting to talk about distributions or something similar to distributions with a different name. And that spins out into all kinds of questions. And it has been a while since we've discussed this topic. There's been a long issue for, I don't know, since the beginning of Backdrop about distributions. But yeah, I'll turn it over to Kevin to kind of frame what the need is for him and kind of what he would like to see. And then we'll kind of go from there. So take it away, Kevin.
Yeah, so we're looking at this from two different approaches. So it's really Tim Stalker from the University of Colorado Denver campus, who is looking at migrating Express sites. So Web Express is the service that's used at Denver and Boulder, and there are roughly 2,500 of those Drupal 7 sites. That is built as a packaged install profile / distribution, but it really isn't maintained on Drupal.org. It uses, a custom DevOps solution. You can run the drush make command and package it yourself, but we don't actually use that packaging functionality on Drupal.org. And I am super excited that Neil Drum just agreed to turn that functionality off on Drupal.org at the end of next month. So that's going to die. So I think it would be, for the same reasons I want it to die on Drupal.org, I think it would be foolish to implement the same thing in Backdrop now. So I'm looking at Backdrop for individual sites that aren't built on that install profile, that were just one-offed over time. And so I'm working with Tim to try to help him with the Web Express. But because we're going to build these sites on Pantheon, we can use the upstream functionality to manage distributing the install profile. So we talked about a couple of things that might make our lives easier in the interim to build the install profile rather than have the user try to enable a super module after installing that has to run through 3 different dependencies, go back, run through the next 3. It would take an awful long time to use the project installer to add all of the projects that the install profile will end up creating. So we don't necessarily need Backdrop to change anything in the way things are structured now. We have everything we need to determine which projects we're using have already been ported. Joseph Flatt was really helpful in tracking down if we want to build our own version of project installer listings, like how that would work. I thought I was going to be really slick and go in there and make that configurable, only to realize it already was. So it's like, well, how do you feed it the JSON then? And that's available too. So we've got all those pieces figured out, and now it's just a question of using the Backdrop upgrade status module on the Drupal sites, and then figuring out which pieces are already working and which pieces need to be migrated.
Wow, so you're taking an approach of potentially running your own project server, kind of like similar to backdropcms.org?
Yeah. So when Jen showed me how the project installer can work on a dev instance on Pantheon, that's kind of one of the things that the current Web Express service offers through some custom code. We have a project on Drupal.org called Profile Module Manager that enables site owners who can't install other modules to be able to install approved bundles of functionality. But rewriting that functionality and the DevOps pieces that go with it doesn't really make any sense when the infrastructure to do something very similar already exists, and the university has already licensed Pantheon for several of the units. So we already have that DevOps, WebOps infrastructure. So we don't need to reinvent that part. So it would just be creating bundling the config exports instead of using features like we did in Drupal 7. But the amount of work we put into all of those custom solutions, the fact that it's already there, is brilliant. So yeah, so we have all those pieces figured out. But Tim had asked me about recipes, and so I'm working on that initiative. That's one of the things that got dropped from the Badcamp presentation. Is the mistake we made with Drupal 8 at CU was just assuming that our use case would be taken care of and not being involved in the initiatives. My computer's doing something really weird here. Sorry, I'm not unplugged from the monitor. Sorry if I'm blinking out here. My computer's trying to figure out which monitors are available. So I was given time to actually participate in that initiative, and Alex Pott is really doing the majority of the development. But recipes are interesting, and I didn't realize that Backdrop also had recipes, or we're starting to have recipes. But the difference in Drupal is that their recipes are entirely YAML, but it's YAML that can be run as part of the installation process. So unlike distributions, the packaged install profiles, we are breaking up the install experience from the managing updates after the thing has been installed, which has been a pain point for the last decade, really, with Drupal 7 install profiles. So as far as the conversations in Backdrop, there's obviously a need to distribute pre-configured example configurations for different use cases. How you do that, though, is like there is yet to be a perfect example of how that should work anywhere. So there's lots of room for experimentation. But like I said, in some of these issues, this is obviously a very, very much an edge case, where we happen to have a large number of sites that are built on the exact same code base. We have a way to do this that doesn't require Backdrop to change anything. But if you want to have the discussion around doing more of this in Backdrop, I'm more than willing to participate in those discussions and add my experience with doing it in different ways.
Just want to interject this because we had various discussions with regards to profiles, and recently we a year and a half ago, we introduced telemetry in Backdrop, which gathers certain data, and recently, like in the last couple of months, we also started gathering information about the installation profile. And there's like a little bit less than last I checked, 2,500 installations of Backdrop, and every single one that reports back, not all of them report back, they don't have telemetry enabled, but those that have a telemetry enabled, they all report the standard installation profile being used. Having said that, that might be because not everyone from D7 started moving yet, right? So just wanted to point that out, as we do have it as a measure, and ask you, Kevin, this Express profile that you have, does it have sensitive information that you cannot share, or does it live publicly?
It's on Dribble.org, but we just don't package it. And like I mentioned in the Badcamp session, there are more installs than what we run at the university. However, it says all over it, this is just for inspiration or to see how we solve some of these problems. The university doesn't support using it outside of our own use case. So we've found them in the wild from time to time. And it's always interesting what parts of it people have chosen to enable running the debug module on your production sites for reasons we can't explain. But yeah, so it's all out there, all the pieces of it. But the thing that really resonated me from Zach's Stanford presentation was that they didn't have to retrain the users. And so we have, at the Boulder campus, we have over 1,000 sites. There's 3,700 content editors that if we radically change the way they build and maintain sites all at once, That's a pretty large group to try to retrain on how to use paragraphs or layout builder or whatever new layout paradigms we come up with. So we're trying to keep things as similar as possible and be able to spin up additional sites that follow these same patterns. So but yeah, everything's out there. It's both the Drupal.org version with the Drush make file and then the GitHub repositories where we actually work. Those are all public as well.
Right, cool. And then it seems that you need to figure out the last details or a few remaining things. But have you decided moving forward to just sort of like move away from profiles with the capabilities, I mean, that Backdrop provides, and
so
like, in configuration and stuff like that? Yeah.
This is what I need to do and what I want the university to do are two different things. So I just have 2 sites at the system level now. I'm not responsible for the 1,000 D7 sites I left behind. I'm trying to help that team because I feel kind of bad about that. So that's where like my path forward, you guys have done a great job about, documenting how to evaluate a site and, compare what needs to be done and prep the site for that. So I'm working on that for the 2 sites that I'm working on. And then Tim Stalker has 150 or so sites that are built on this same install profile. And so he's doing the same thing. So we don't have to move those sites to a distribution or install profile. But if we're going to continue to launch new sites, they need to be launched and configured the exact same way every time. And so that's what the install profile process gave us. But no, right now, so I created the project. I just created a fork of the standard install profile and started building that out to see what still worked and what didn't work there. And I believe I have to put that in core. Is that correct? Does anybody know that can I create a profiles directory at the root level and it'll still pick it up?
Correct.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so we started building the profile and just checking things like, can I still put modules in the profile directory? I can. Then the question comes up, should I still put modules in the profile directory? So that's where Alejandro works for CU Boulder, but then has been building Backdrop sites on his own, independent of the university. And so Tim and I are going to get together with him and get more feedback on, okay, like, let's not just make assumptions about this is how we did it in Drupal. Let's make Backdrop work the same way. So we are open to reevaluating all of this.
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind. Although the reason why I asked before if the profile is available is just so that I can experiment. But there's a few things that have gotten into Backdrop that may make things easier. Like we recently had some sort of duplicate module detection, and I'm thinking now, how do you remove? Because I think there was a module in Drupal that helped you, like profile remover or something like that, that would help you.
Profile switcher.
Switcher, yeah.
I wrote the Drupal 7 version of that and was shocked to see it in Backdrop. Like, why is this here? Who is using this?
Yeah. But yeah, my point is that I remember the issue where we, in the status page, we reported there's duplicate modules and which versions they are, but I'm not, like, maybe we can make things work. But if people want to move away from profiles because it is a pain, then we can work towards, helping them out by not having Backdrop blow up if they put the modules. Yeah.
This is where compose. So I used to think that having the different levels of the same module at different versions was very useful. Now I think it's super crazy to have duplicate code in your build. But without Composer, I really don't know how an individual instance would get ahead of the profile or run a patched version of something. So that's one of the things with the composer and an upstream configuration, like the standard Pantheon build, we can have our supported upstream, and then the customizations that each individual projects does. The project can trump the upstream, but they do it in Composer, so the build only ends up with one version of the code in there per build. And then if we get back in sync, then they can remove the patch or the override forward or backwards, whatever they're doing. So that's where I don't know with how much more stable Backdrop is, if we would ever even need to do that. But that was the only real reason we ever used that functionality, to put something, trump core with the profile, then profile with the individual site project. But looking at those sites now, I think that's absolutely insane to put multiple copies of a module in the build.
I remember seeing that and going, that's interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, everyone, like every team that has to manage a handful of sites, like we in GovCMS have a module that specifically, like, it has no code. It only has dependencies. So we enable it so that the dependencies can be enabled, and then we disable it, which is, yeah. So.
Well, so part of why I was suggesting we talked about this was that we've got somebody, Graham in our forum, is trying to write a book about getting started with Backdrop, and doesn't like the term distribution. And my first reaction, well, it doesn't really matter because there isn't really anybody we're not really using distribution. So why worry about that term? And then right away, Kevin says, oh, I'm launching a distribution. so I thought, well, great.
I'm migrating a I'm rebuilding a distribution.
Well, you've clarified that now. So.
But I don't know. It doesn't have to be the way it was before.
Sure.
But you do have distributions listed on backdropcms.org with the disclaimer that they're not, indexed or listed in there. And so that's where, like, we're willing to, go in whatever direction, you guys think is best. But let me ask you this, with recipes and kind of what you were doing, Tim, with the I can't remember what was the recipe that I was talking to you about? Was it FAQ?
I don't know. I don't remember which one. It could be.
It was one that you were.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, Drupal, so one of the issues with the core initiative is to rewrite Unami as a recipe instead of as a install profile. And that to me makes a lot of sense. But what this is going to unlock inevitably is having more demos. So there's been, countless attempts to do a demo framework. Acquia ran an install profile that was nothing but, spinning up Drupal in different configurations for these different sales demos. But the challenge has always been that when you do that, and Unami has this issue as well, if you wanted to build a restaurant site and you decided to use Unami as the base, you'd have a really bad time because it's not designed to be automatically upgradable. And so that's where, the lesson learned from distributions on Drupal.org was with Drush Make, they were really easy to build. You just go into an existing site, you exported the Drush Make, you got all the dependencies, and then you started capturing everything in features and built your install profile and you were done. However, updating those was more difficult, and then updating them in the use case where people could take them and go whatever direction they wanted, and you would really have no idea, was infinitely more complicated than supporting an individual contrib project, because you just didn't know what they had built on top of what you had given them. Right. And so that's where I'm kind of interested in what you guys were thinking with recipes and how those would work. And if that's kind of the model for capturing a bundle of feature functionality that we want to be able to talk about with end users.
Sure. Well, do we? I could try to answer that question in terms of. I mean, I think our thinking isn't that far along. Do I want to keep talking about this, Nate?
Yeah, I think go ahead.
Okay. So recipes, just we realized that we could create sort of feature-like things with just config files, right? That just was possible in Backdrop. And the idea was for simple things like you want to add an FAQ, you can drop a few config files into your site, and you've added that content. And again, it's the nearest comparable thing I think in Drupal was a feature, although this is far from, it's not nearly as complicated as that. And then when I started playing with those, I started then, well, first of all, there was one or two bugs that was preventing that from happening. So we got that to work just as a module, right? So recipes aren't a different type of thing in Backdrop yet. They're just modules. The original idea was that they would be config-only modules. Modules that just added some config files. But once I started playing with that, I realized, well, this feature isn't very good unless it like requires a module. So then I just added, and because it was a module, I could add a dependency. So in some of my some of my recipes, I've included dependencies. And then in some of them, I said, well, you know what, this recipe would be a lot nicer if there were some sample content when you launched it. So then I used PHP to add a little bit of sample content. And now recipes are really just modules that I've been thinking about them as modules that don't really add any new functionality. They basically add configuration to your site, maybe some content and maybe even a little bit of styling. But I don't know if that's the right definition of recipes. From what I understand, we keep talking about, well, what are the limitations of this module? And we come up with the things that I think you're trying to address. One is they're not uninstallable. Once you install them, you just have them. Two, well, I think that's the big one. The advantage of recipes over install profiles is that you can add them later, right? It's not only on install, so you can add a recipe to an existing site.
But because they're a module, the user who installed it is going to see every update for that going forward. Right?
Yeah,
they're not on install only config imports.
Sure, they're not on install only. On the other hand, I didn't really envision recipes as things that you would update, right? You would install them and they would make changes to your site and then you'd be done with them. And so like the original idea with the recipe was you could enable it and then you could disable it and it would continue to work. But then when I started adding some other things to it, like dependencies and others, I realized, well, now you can't just disable it. But I wasn't envisioning that people would update their recipe because that wasn't sort of in our original idea. But anyways, I don't know if our original idea was the right idea. I mean, I think we would love something like what Drupal is calling recipes, but I think there's a lot more infrastructure work or a lot more tools that would have to be built. And I'm not personally able to build the tools that would help figure out how to uninstall a recipe. That seems like a much more complicated problem. And I'm not sure if we have, enough people interested in this right now. I have to say that everybody's interested in the concept of recipes, but I think most of us have other priorities. So there hasn't been much, to my knowledge, nobody's created a recipe except me. So, which is a good indication of like the lack of momentum.
I mean, your description of recipes is what we built at Boulder for bundles, which is just a module naming convention for custom feature exports plus a secure permission configuration to capture the permission changes. But that's also how we managed updating those collection of features. Is we would have a forms bundle, a news bundle, an advanced design bundle, and we start people with a core CMS configuration, and then as they needed, if they needed a new section of the site, they could turn that on, but they would be able to discover those recipe collections through our own version of Project Browser, and we would have the permission set up that all of our defined roles would get their proper permissions for that.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. We've got 15 minutes. I'm really curious, and this is a total pivot, because okay, so recipes, that's the state of them as we have them now. We talk about recipes fairly frequently, actually. Like at least like it. I mean, we've been talking about this for like the last 3 years, on and off. Yeah, and like Tim says, the momentum, like the interest is there, but like the ambition to actually do it is limited. Um, but yeah, what I'd like to ask, you touched on real briefly, um, is if Composer does factor into this in any way. And there's been an issue, issue 2257, support using Backdrop with Composer, that's been open for a long time. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
It,
and
it,
yeah, I'm just curious, like, if this factors into your needs or your plans at all.
so if you look at that Express project, I wrote out the instructions for spinning up Backdrop with Composer. And then the first piece I need to get working is the authentication, the single sign-on piece, which is easier with the Simple SAML PHP library, to add that with Composer. So you have this Joel from Atten ported the Simple SAML PHP auth module. There are some issues with that module. I've opened a couple and offered to help get that to a 1.0 release, but it actually functions. But like that's where I don't know if I'm crazy. Like I'm always gonna approach things from a Composer perspective currently. And so that's where, like, for me, like I can figure out how to build these pieces. I don't know. I don't think there's anything that truly depends on Composer, but Composer just makes our, grabbing those external libraries easier for things like the authentication, adding the symlinks where they need to go to add the certs and everything for that configuration. So we're just modeling our D9 configuration and making the changes required to work with a more D7 like module to get that to work. So, but we could easily do that a dozen other ways. So
not
yeah,
necessarily
I don't
critical.
I don't think anything we're talking about depends on Composer.
Yeah, this just generally is, I think, a discussion that is probably worth revisiting. We haven't had it in. I don't think we've had it in a long time. Not like recipes that we talk about pretty frequently. Like the world of Composer. Well, I'm not really sure changed is correct, but it has definitely matured. It's really kind of interesting that everything is settled down now, and I think we've seen where Composer is useful, and we've also seen how the broader PHP system uh, interacts with Composer. And from what I've seen, I'm pleased that at least like Composer seems like it's an option, but not required for almost all API SDKs that I've seen. So like various things like I don't know, Facebook SDK or Stripe SDK, like they have these PHP libraries that let you integrate with their products. And all of them have Composer support. So if you want to say Composer install, Stripe API, you can do that. But they also all include autoloaders of their own that are just like, if you just want to include this autoloader file and not use Composer, then that's also an option. So I'm really happy that that's the case, because it gives projects like ours the option of not using Composer yet still using third-party dependencies. It seemed like for a little while there was a chance that all PHP projects might get shoved into like you just have to use Composer in order to integrate with third-party things, but it doesn't look like that ended up being the case. So that's a relief, at least, that we're not being forced into this. But it also, like, Composer has also become a lot more ubiquitous, that it seems like installing stuff with Composer is pretty expected, that you can install just about anything. And I was reading beforehand, because I thought we were going to get into this this meeting. Now we are, I guess, about WordPress and which direction they're kind of going with this. And it's interesting because they have the same kind of not only the same challenges that we do. They're all-inclusive monolithic CMS essentially. but also they have the same philosophy as us, that they want to make sure that WordPress is as accessible to as many people as possible, and they don't want to introduce a command line dependency ever. Like that's never can be a requirement of WordPress. So in WordPress land, it needs to remain at the very least optional. But it's also interesting that you can install WordPress with Composer, but I guess you can also install Backdrop with Composer in the similar fashion that there's, a separately maintained repository that includes a composer.json file, and we put Backdrop up on Packagist. WordPress actually apparently is maintaining their own version of Packagist for all plugins and themes and everything. Which is definitely more comprehensive than ours. Like because right now we only support the Backdrop Packagist repository only includes really Backdrop core. It doesn't include contrib modules. So you could install Backdrop core, but not anything else really.
I think an important perspective to look at with that is security audits and the number of tools that are built to essentially use the project's manifest files to determine whether it's including code that isn't secure. And so that's where I think in the interim, just having the version of PHP, the version of Backdrop, the version of Simple SAML PHP is enough for our security team to be like, okay, well, what you add after you do the install is up to you, and depend on the Backdrop's own reporting for security updates there. But in an ideal world, your Composer JSON file would give you the versions of everything that you've installed, whether it's patched or not, all of that stuff.
Yeah, if there's one thing I really miss, it's Composer patches. I think that is I think that is fantastic. I would be tempted to manage a site with Composer just to apply my patches.
Yeah, I think that's the absolute worst thing that can happen to open source, because then once a developer has a patch for a problem, they're never checking to see if there's a security problem with that patch. They're never checking to see if anyone has ever updated that patch. And as long as the patch applies to the module, that project is never getting any more attention.
You're forced to address, I mean, if the patch is applied, your build will fail because it can't be reapplied.
That's only if the so that would be if it was committed.
You're right.
Well, or if the module
or
had been
something
updated.
else, yeah.
There are a lot of projects that like never get any changes in the patch you're running will apply for 10 years, even though there's a massive security vulnerability in your patch, and you wouldn't know that because you're never checking the issue to see if there's any issues with it. So there is some work going on in the Drupal community about this, like Composer causes less open source contribution issue, where they're trying to put like better documentation in the Composer messaging so that it will be like, this is not the most recent comment on your issue anymore. Stuff like that to try and prompt developers to look at issues. But it is, I think, a problem that we would need to figure out with Composer.
Well, the security teams also consider lots of patches in your manifest file of problems. So if you're working at the enterprise level, someone's going to complain about that, even if you think it's okay.
Well, anyway, I guess we don't need to get into it any further. I'm not sure that we actually can because we're running out of time during this meeting. But I think it's an interesting thing to evaluate. I'm not sure that we'll really land anywhere different, especially as far as core itself operates. I really don't envision us adding dependencies, ones managed via Composer, anytime soon. But the use case I think is interesting, and the ones that would be most likely that we see are people managing their Backdrop sites with Composer. And I know that opens up all kinds of issues. Things like our project installer, for example. Kevin was saying it's so great that you guys have project installer. That only works because we don't have dependencies in our modules, right? As soon as a module has a dependency that's externally managed or installed via Composer, that module doesn't work via the project browser anymore. And so, I mean, that's a blessing and a curse. Stripe module, again, is a great example. It bundles the entire Stripe API. And so when you install the Stripe module, it actually works. However, using the Stripe module recently, I found out that that version of the API or SDK is like 2 years old, and I couldn't use some of the features I was expecting to see. And so, had that been done with Composer, that wouldn't have been a problem.
But your module might not have worked because it's depending on an older version of the library that hasn't been updated.
Well, my module would have worked if I would have been able to update it, and it didn't work because it was too old. So, I mean, yeah.
And then the issue that keeps coming up in Drupal is front end dependencies with recipes and updating the modernizing distributions. Like we're reliving the same WYSIWYG plugin arguments we had 10 years ago. Even the initial install profile packaging didn't allow third-party dependencies, and we were still had rules about adding 10K of JavaScript in your module if it ever existed anywhere before Drupal. And so, yeah, I mean, how useful is a automatic update if you can't update the front end dependencies that go with the project? So there's a lot of discussions happening around that as well. No, concrete solutions. A lot of people have lots of opinions, and so it takes a long time to get any kind of coalesce around any kind of consensus. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, as far as like if we convert our bundles to recipes, they would still be opinionated in that they're designed to work with the theming that goes along with the install profile. Now, can we create generic versions of this functionality? Sure, we probably could do that as well. Can we do that in the time we have to migrate all these sites? Probably not. So that's where I don't know if we should keep those, like create backdrop recipe modules that we don't put in backdrop, or we put them out there with a disclaimer like we're doing now on Drupal.org that says this is only going to work with the Express install profile, which is really only designed to work for this one use case. You could fork this and do whatever you want with it, but at least that way people know it's there. So, and we don't have to come to any kind of consensus now, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how we should move forward with that.
Yeah, kind of as usual. It seems like the direction this conversation is headed is what we're doing right now is fine. It's like, and the other options are a lot of work and not necessarily better, and introduce new problems. So yeah, we've got problems with what we're doing right now, like the out of date dependencies, for example. And there's problems with switching that, create all kinds of new issues. And so, yeah, the decisions that we've made right now, though, there's clear reasons for sticking with them. Project Browser working, for example, is the most compelling reason.
Yeah.
And Update Manager for that matter. That Update Manager also updates your dependencies as long as your dependencies are bundled. It is interesting. Like we let Contrib kind of decide. There is still, I think I can't remember what it's called, Composer Dependencies module or something like that, that if you want to use Composer and have it exposed through the backdrop UI, if your dependencies are up to date, there's also like that option. And a lot of modules also like they bundle a copy. I think Stripe does this again. They bundle a copy. But they check the vendor directory, and like if there's something in the vendor directory, then they take that one instead. So there's all kinds of like, Contrib is kind of experimenting a little bit with different ways of managing their dependencies, and I think that's also, great. It would be nice if it's not great that they do it in different ways, but it is great that they're trying to figure out what works. So,
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Any closing thoughts from anyone else? Okay. Well, Kevin, thanks for joining. Justin, thanks for joining here at the tail end. But yeah, we're gonna wrap up, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here today, and thank you out there for watching. All right. Bye.